It's February 23, 1945. 6 American Marines struggle up a volcanic slope, carrying a piece of cloth that weighs less than 20 pounds. In 30 seconds, they'll create the most famous photograph in military history. But here's what most people don't know. This wasn't the first flag they raised that day. And the real story behind this moment is far more complex, far more tragic, and infinitely more human than the legend suggests. Today we're diving deep into one of World War II's most misunderstood moments. A story that begins not with heroism, but with a bureaucratic request for a bigger flag. A story where 3 of the 6 men in that iconic photograph would be dead within days. And where the survivors would carry burdens that no ticker tape parade could ever heal. This is the true story of Iwo Jima's flag raising, and why everything you think you know about it might be wrong. To understand what happened on Mount Suribachi that February morning, we need to go back 5 days earlier, to February 19th, when 30,000 American Marines first set foot on 8 square miles of volcanic hell. Iwo Jima wasn't just any Pacific island. It was a fortress. 4 months, 22,000 Japanese defenders had burrowed into its volcanic rock, creating a labyrinth of tunnels, bunkers, and gun emplacements that turned every yard of ground into a killing field. The Japanese commander, General Tadamaki Suribachi, had a simple strategy: make the Americans pay in blood for every inch. He succeeded beyond his darkest imagination. The invasion began at dawn. As the first wave of Marines hit the black volcanic beaches, they encountered something unprecedented in Pacific warfare: silence. No artillery. No machine gun fire. Just the sound of boots crunching on volcanic ash and the distant crash of waves. It was a trap. The Japanese waited until 30,000 Americans were crowded onto those narrow beaches, sitting ducks in an open-air killing field. Then Suribachi gave the order and Iwo Jima erupted. Mortars rained from hidden positions. Machine guns opened fire from caves carved into the cliff faces. Artillery shells, pre-sighted on every inch of beach, began falling like deadly rain. In the first hour, more Marines died on Iwo Jima than in most entire Pacific campaigns. But the Marines pressed forward. They had no choice. Behind them was the ocean. Ahead was hell. And somewhere in that hell was Mount Suribachi, a 554-foot extinct volcano that dominated the southern tip of the island like a malevolent god. Among the thousands of Marines clawing their way across that hellish landscape were 6 men whose names would soon be etched into American memory. But on February 19th, they were just faces in the crowd, young men far from home, carrying rifles and doubt in equal measure. There was Ira Hayes, a 22-year-old Pima Indian from Arizona. Quiet, introspective, already showing signs of the alcoholism that would later destroy him. His fellow Marines called him Chief, not always kindly. Hayes had enlisted to prove that Native Americans were real Americans too. He had no idea that photograph would make him the most famous Native American of his generation, and that the fame would kill him. Franklin Sousley was 19, blonde, handsome, with the kind of smile that belonged on a movie poster, not a battlefield. He was from Kentucky tobacco country, the kind of small-town boy who still wrote letters to his mother every week. Sousley dreamed of coming home, marrying his sweetheart, raising children who would never know war. He had 11 days left to live. Harlan Block, 20 years old, Texas tough, a high school football star who traded shoulder pads for combat gear. Block was the kind of Marine other Marines looked up to: strong, reliable, unafraid. His mother would spend 2 years fighting the government to get his name on the memorial, because initially he wasn't even identified in the photograph. Michael Strank, at 25, was the old man of the group. A sergeant, born in Czechoslovakia, raised in Pennsylvania coal country. Strank was a Marine's Marine, tough, experienced, the kind of NCO who kept young Marines alive through experience and instinct. He'd been fighting across the Pacific for 2 years. He had 6 days left. Rene Gagnon, 19, from New Hampshire, carried himself like a movie star and had the swagger to match. Handsome, confident, always ready with a joke or a story. Gagnon was the kind of guy who seemed destined for good things. He'd survive the war, but the photograph would haunt him for the rest of his life. And finally, John Bradley, 21, a Navy corpsman from Wisconsin. Not a Marine, but something more important, a medic. While others carried rifles, Bradley carried hope. He'd already earned a Navy Cross for crawling through enemy fire to save wounded Marines. He was the quiet hero who never talked about heroism. None of them knew they were about to make history. They were just trying to survive another day in hell. By February 23rd, the Marines had been fighting for 4 days straight. Every yard forward cost blood. Every position taken required a small miracle of courage and firepower. But slowly, inexorably, they were advancing toward Mount Suribachi. The volcano loomed over everything, a perfect observation post for Japanese artillery spotters. As long as the enemy held Suribachi, every Marine on the island was a target. Taking the mountain wasn't just tactically necessary, it was psychological warfare. Suribachi had become a symbol of Japanese resistance. It needed to fall. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson of the 28th Marine Regiment had a simple order for his men: take the mountain. But he had something else in mind too, a symbol of American determination. Go up there, Johnson told a patrol on the morning of February 23rd, and put a flag on the highest spot you can find. The patrol, led by Lieutenant Harold Schreier, began the treacherous climb up Suribachi's northern slope. They expected to fight for every foot. Japanese snipers had been picked off the mountain for days. Surely there would be a final, desperate battle at the summit. But something strange happened. As the Marines climbed higher, the resistance faded. The Japanese, it seemed, had abandoned their positions on the peak during the night. At 10:20 a.m., the patrol reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. They found a piece of Japanese pipe, about 20 feet long, perfect for a flagpole. Someone had brought a small American flag, about 4 feet by 6 feet. Nothing spectacular, just a standard garrison flag. They tied it to the pipe, raised it high, and planted it in the volcanic soil. Below, on the beaches and across the island, Marines and sailors looked up and saw something they'd been fighting for: the stars and stripes flying over Japanese territory. Cheers erupted across the island. Ship horns blared in the harbor. For the first time since the invasion began, American morale soared. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal was making his way up the mountain when the first flag was raised. He missed the shot. The most famous war photographer of his generation almost missed the most famous photograph of the war. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. That first flag, that moment of triumph, it wasn't enough for Lieutenant Colonel Johnson. Looking up at the small banner fluttering in the Pacific wind, he made a decision that would change everything. That flag's too small, he told his aide. Get me a bigger one. And that's where our story really begins. What happened next was pure bureaucracy dressed up as heroism. Johnson wanted a flag that could be seen from across the island. He sent René Gagnon up the mountain with a replacement flag. This one 8 feet by 4 feet 8 inches, borrowed from a Navy landing ship. The order was simple: swap the flags. Bring the small one back as a souvenir for Johnson. Take up the big one and make it visible. At 1 p.m., Gagnon reached the summit with the new flag. The 6 men, Hayes, Sousley, Block, Strank, Bradley, and Gagnon, gathered around the makeshift flagpole. Their mission wasn't to plant a flag in conquered soil. It was simply to replace one flag with another. Joe Rosenthal had finally made it to the top, his camera ready. But he wasn't expecting anything dramatic. This was just a routine flag change and administrative detail. He positioned himself about 15 feet away from the flagpole, adjusted his camera settings for the bright Pacific sun, and waited. The Marines lowered the first flag while simultaneously raising the second. It was coordinated, efficient, thoroughly unmilitary in its casual execution. Rosenthal raised his camera, not even looking through the viewfinder, and pressed the shutter. Click. 1/400th of a second. That's all it took. In that fraction of a moment, 6 young men became immortal. Not because they performed some extraordinary act of heroism, but because they were caught in an ordinary moment that looked extraordinary. But here's the twist that most people never learn. Rosenthal didn't know he'd captured anything special. He shot the photograph almost blindly, then immediately turned to take posed shots of the Marines celebrating around the flag. Those posed photographs, he thought, would be the ones that made it into the newspapers. He couldn't have been more wrong. The film canister containing that accidental masterpiece was rushed to Guam, where it was developed, printed, and transmitted via radio to newspaper offices across America. By the time Rosenthal returned to his base that evening, the photograph was already on its way to newspaper front pages around the world. Within 18 hours, that image, born of bureaucracy, captured by accident, showing a routine flag change on a godforsaken island most Americans couldn't find on a map, became the most recognized photograph in American history. But for the 6 men in the image, immortality came at a price they never expected to pay. Here's what the photograph doesn't show. Iwo Jima was far from over. While newspapers across America celebrated the flag raising as a symbol of inevitable victory, the men who raised that flag were still fighting for their lives on an island that refused to surrender. The Japanese hadn't abandoned Iwo Jima. They'd simply changed tactics. Instead of trying to hold ground, they'd gone underground. Miles of tunnels connected hundreds of defensive positions. Every cave, every bunker, every spider hole had to be cleared individually, often by Marines crawling through darkness with flamethrowers and grenades. Michael Strank, the Czech-born sergeant who'd kept so many young Marines alive, was killed by artillery fire on March 1st, 6 days after the flag raising. He was leading a patrol when a Japanese shell landed directly on his position. The man who'd survived 2 years of Pacific warfare died just days after achieving immortality. Franklin Sousley, the Kentucky farm boy with the movie star smile, died on March 21st. A Japanese sniper's bullet found him during the final push to secure the island. He was 19 years old. His mother received 2 letters on the same day, one informing her that her son was famous, the other that he was dead. Harlan Block, the Texas football star, was killed by mortar fire on March 1st, the same day as Strank. For 2 years, his mother fought to get his name associated with the photograph. The military had initially misidentified him. The most famous image in American military history, and they couldn't even get the names right. Of the 6 men in that photograph, only 3 survived Iwo Jima: Hayes, Bradley, and Gagnon. But survival, as they would learn, came with its own unique form of hell. The war ended, the parades were held, and America celebrated its heroes. But for the 3 surviving flag raisers, the photograph became a curse disguised as a blessing. The military needed money for war bonds, and they'd found their poster boys. Hayes, Bradley, and Gagnon were pulled off the front lines and sent on a nationwide publicity tour. They were supposed to be heroes, symbols of American triumph, inspiration for a nation still at war. But they were just young men who'd done a job and survived when their friends hadn't. They'd raised a flag, not conquered an empire. They'd followed orders, not performed miracles. Yet everywhere they went, crowds cheered them as conquering heroes. John Bradley, the Navy corpsman, hated every moment of it. He gave his speeches, posed for his photographs, and sold his war bonds. But he never talked about Iwo Jima. Not to reporters, not to his family, not to his children. For the rest of his life, he kept his medals in a drawer and his memories locked away. He'd seen too much death to celebrate surviving. René Gagnon tried to parlay his fame into something lasting. He attempted careers in business, politics, entertainment. But America wanted its heroes to remain frozen in that moment on Mount Suribachi. They didn't want to see them grow old, struggle with mortgages, or fail at civilian life. Gagnon died in poverty, forgotten by the same nation that had once celebrated him. But it was Ira Hayes who paid the highest price. The Pima Indian who'd enlisted to prove his patriotism found himself celebrated as a symbol of American diversity, the token Native American in the Great Melting Pot narrative. He was paraded at events, featured in magazine articles, presented as proof that America embraced all its children. The irony was crushing. Hayes came from a reservation where his people lacked running water, electricity, and basic medical care. He'd been raised in a government boarding school designed to kill the Indian and save the man. And now he was being celebrated as an American hero while his people remained forgotten. The bottle became his refuge. Hayes died in 1955, at age 32, of exposure and alcohol poisoning. He was found in a field on the Gila River Reservation, frozen to death, alone. The most famous Native American of his generation died exactly where he'd started, on a reservation, forgotten by the country that had made him famous. But the photograph lived on, taking on a life of its own, becoming something far more powerful than the moment it captured. It became the template for American heroism, the visual definition of courage, sacrifice, and unity. The image inspired the Marine Corps War Memorial in Washington, D.C., the massive bronze sculpture that shows the flag raisers frozen in their moment of triumph. It appeared on stamps, posters, magazine covers, and movie screens. It became shorthand for American values, American determination, American victory. Yet the more famous the photograph became, the further it drifted from its reality. It wasn't a moment of conquest, it was a flag change. It wasn't a celebration of victory, it was a routine military operation. It wasn't even the first flag raised on Suribachi that day. The photograph succeeded because it looked like what Americans wanted heroism to look like. 6 men working together, struggling against the elements to raise their nation's symbol. No individual glory-seeking, no Hollywood dramatics, just ordinary Americans doing extraordinary things. It captured something true about the American military experience, even if the specific moment was mundane. These were citizen soldiers, men who'd left their farms and factories and small towns to fight a war they didn't start in places they'd never heard of. They weren't professional warriors, they were Americans doing a job. The photograph also revealed the power of images in modern warfare. This wasn't just combat anymore, it was a media war fought as much for hearts and minds as for territory. That single image, transmitted around the world in a matter of hours, did more for American morale than dozens of military victories. But it also demonstrated the dangerous gap between symbols and reality, between what we want our heroes to be and what they actually are. The 6 men in that photograph became symbols, but symbols aren't human. Symbols don't struggle with survivors' guilt, alcoholism, or the simple difficulty of living up to impossible expectations. So what are we to make of this story? What does it tell us about heroism, about war, about the price of fame in a media-driven world? Perhaps it tells us that real heroism isn't found in photographs. It's found in the 1,000 small acts of courage that never make the news. John Bradley saving wounded Marines under fire. Michael Strank keeping his squad alive through experience and leadership. Ira Hayes serving his country despite a lifetime of discrimination. The flag raising wasn't heroic because it was photographed. It was heroic because those men were there, on that island, doing that job, when they could have been anywhere else in the world. Perhaps it tells us that we need to be careful about what we ask of our symbols. When we turn human beings into icons, we rob them of their humanity. We expect them to be perfect, unchanging, eternally heroic. But heroes are just people, and people are complicated. Ira Hayes wasn't just the Native American in the famous photograph. He was a man struggling with trauma, discrimination, and impossible expectations. Franklin Sousley wasn't just a face in an iconic image. He was a 19-year-old who wanted to go home to Kentucky and never got the chance. Perhaps most importantly, it tells us that the real story is always more complex than the symbol. The flag raising on Iwo Jima has become a perfect moment in American memory, a moment of pure triumph, uncomplicated by doubt or tragedy. But the real story is messier, sadder, and ultimately more human. The photograph endures because it captures something true about American identity, the idea that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when their country asks it of them. But the men in that photograph remind us that heroism comes at a cost, and that cost is always paid by human beings, not symbols. 36 days of fighting on Iwo Jima cost 6,800 American lives and 21,000 wounded. Nearly all 22,000 Japanese defenders died. 8 square miles of volcanic rock that would be abandoned the moment the war ended. Was it worth it? That's not for us to decide. But we owe it to the men who fought there, and especially to the 6 who raised that flag, to remember them as they were. Not symbols, not icons, but human beings who answered their country's call and paid a price we can barely imagine. The next time you see that photograph, remember, this isn't a story about a flag. It's a story about 6 young men far from home, doing their job on a terrible day in a terrible place. And that, perhaps, is the most heroic thing of all. If this story moved you, if it changed how you see that famous photograph, then share it. Because these men deserve to be remembered not just as symbols, but as human beings. And their story, the real story with all its complexity and tragedy, deserves to be told. Their sacrifice was real. Their pain was real. Their humanity was real. And that's what makes them truly heroic.